Lakeside is pleased to sponsor this exciting broadcast featuring Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy on Voice America.
Welcome to Creating Presence with your hosts, Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy. Over the next hour, you'll learn about the processes that steer our hearts and minds and how to improve our collective social health.
Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my colleague, Sarah Yanosy.
Hello, everyone.
Sarah and I have developed an organizational intervention to help whole organizations integrate trauma-informed practice. And we use the word presence, and we use it as an acronym, standing for Partnership and Power, Reverence and Restoration, Emotional Wisdom and Empathy, Safety and Social Responsibility, Embodiment and Enactment, Nature and Nurture, Culture and Complexity, and Emergence and Evolution. In this podcast series, we're looking at each of the letters in the acronym and talking with experts and thought leaders who are in a variety of areas to help us expand our thinking and our work to improve collective social health. Today, our focus is on the second E in the acronym, and it stands for Embodiment and Enactment. And we're going to take a deeper dive into this topic with a social health focus on really how actions speak louder than words.
The terms embodiment and enactment may not be very familiar to everyone. So I'm going to simplify them, actually probably oversimplify them. But in my mind, this concept or this pair really means that the past shows up in the present. And it does that in our bodies, which is where we think of the term embodiment. And they show up in our bodies. The past shows up in our bodies through our thoughts and our feelings, and in our behavior, which is where the enactment part comes in. And what happens to us in our lives influences not just how we think and feel and behave, but also how we relate to other people. And this is especially important in our work with creating presence when we're working with organizations, because the dynamics around authority, expectations of other people, nurturing, and respect all get played out with the people that we work with and with the people that we serve. The repetition of trauma is often something that brings people into treatment, right? I worked with a lot of patients who say, like, I just don't understand why this keeps happening. The same pattern in my life, the same relationship just, keeps showing up. And I don't know, is it me? And often the answer is yes, it is you. But more importantly, it's what's happened to you and what you're embodying and what you're enacting. But this repetition of trauma can also happen among staff members and leaders. So when we're coaching organizations, we focus our work on helping people recognize and disrupt unhealthy patterns and dynamics in their teams. And often they don't even know that these are playing out, and they don't know that they're based on the past. But we also focus our work in creating presence on encouraging our organization to use expressive therapies with the patients, clients, or people that they serve.
Yeah, one of the, I think, breakthrough points for us when we were running a psychiatric unit was we would talk and talk and talk and talk to people, and they would know what symptoms that they had, but we didn't really make any progress with people getting better until we could use the expressive therapies. And we started with art therapy and psychodrama and movement therapy, and that was breakthrough. And now we understand that what was happening was that we were able to provide processes that helped integrate the left language-based hemisphere and the right nonverbal hemisphere so that they would really talk to each other, which was so powerful. It was like putting Humpty Dumpty back together again.
So we want to expand on this conversation by inviting a guest to join us. And we want to introduce psychiatrist Dr. Lindra Bills, who works as the Senior Medical Director for Community Care Behavioral Health, which is a subsidiary of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And she's going to share some of her stories related to embodiment and enactment. And she's also going to draw from her experience from therapeutic techniques that she's developed. One is trauma art narrative therapy, and the other is video dialogue. Welcome, Lindra. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks, Sarah and Sandy. I'm happy to join you guys. It's an important topic, so thanks.
What background or experiences can you share that have helped you in really understanding what the embodiment of traumatic experiences means?
Well, I'll say my training had a big impact on this. So I was very fortunate to have trained as an internist and a psychiatrist at the same time. So I'm always thinking in a mind-body connection, an integrated approach. And in my residency, I had a great mentor and lieutenant who conceptualized and really understood what could happen, how somatic symptoms could be a manifestation of traumatic experiences and dissociation and other body manifestations. And he really appreciated that disconnect, the brain kind of disconnecting and the need to integrate.
Lindra, can you tell our listeners what somatic symptoms means?
Sure. So this is really the body. So the use of the term somatic is really body. And so anything that manifests in the body or a person kind of describes. But when I'm talking about it here, when we were thinking about this piece that's tied to earlier life experiences and traumatic experiences, unrelated to, something really physical. So like something separate, meaning related to their emotional or earlier life experience, basically, that makes sense.
What types of interventions are useful for embodiment and reenactment of traumatic experiences? And why do these interventions help?
Well, you already mentioned the importance of the nonverbal and creative arts. So that's so true. And when I was thinking about on this topic, I have to say, for me, I go back to good old biopsychosocial model. And I know nobody likes to use that term anymore. That's at least how it seems to me. But it's important to understand the possibility. So to me, interventions first, you've got to educate people. So you got to educate clinicians at all levels, and they have to understand the possibility that something somebody experienced could manifest physically. And that's kind of is not obvious to everybody. So I think you have to start there. And then besides that, you move into specific interventions, obviously the creative arts interventions, different things, like you mentioned, trauma art narrative therapy, which I've developed as a non-interpretive drawing method to weave together and narrate somebody's traumatic experience with, a narration and cognitive concepts. But there are other things. EMDR comes to mind. Certainly all the evidence-based therapies that work on memory focus and resolution of traumatic experiences have some role to play. Not everybody responds to the same method, but I also think you have to include the creative arts. You can't leave them out. So art therapy and movement and psychodrama, what Sandy was mentioning, so critical. And some people will need more of that than others. And if you're not aware that you need to make that link, if you don't recognize the body memories not really getting better, or reenactment not improving, what you mentioned earlier, Sarah, then you're missing the piece. You have to add those other components in there.
Is it a
Yeah.
different part of the brain that you're accessing through the arts? Like, what is it about the expressive arts that makes it so useful?
Well, now there is a better understanding neurologically that there can be this difficulty with an expression or a person's understanding of their own expression. So, the idea that they don't have words to talk about what happened, but it's going to come out anyway in the body memories or reenactments. It's easier to see from the outside than it may be for that person experiencing it. And I think specifically reenactments, for instance, I think you need a team approach. I think you really need the thinking and collaboration of a group often. I'm not saying always, but sometimes when everybody's trying different things, different methods, different interventions, and the person continues with the same patterned repetition, and they're not making progress, you should bring the team together to brainstorm about what may be happening so you could recognize often a reenactment.
I remember many years ago that you taught me how to do trauma art narrative, and I worked with a person who I had worked with for years, and only when we did, and I didn't know anything about what was revealed as a result of doing the trauma art narrative. It was amazing and changed the whole course of treatment. So can you describe it a little bit, what it is?
Yes, so it is a method, as I mentioned, a non-interpretive method. So for one specific traumatic event at a time. And you're really helping the person do some drawings. So there's drawing steps. And then there is also, some narration. You help the person narrate and put it together. So it becomes like an integrated story that they can reference and respond to and alter as they need to. But that's the idea. So it doesn't require an art therapist can do it, but it's not required that you are trained as an art therapist to use this method because you're not interpreting the drawings at all. So it's just a way to help the person get that material out. I always think like get it out of their body, out of their mind, so they can look at it, try to get some objectivity, and then try to put it together to help with what's going on with their internal representation of whatever happened.
Yeah, the part that doesn't have any words attached to it. And then they can find the words, right? That's how it works.
Yeah, exactly. And I used it many times for specific cases. You mentioned that, Sarah. Many people who had body memories and they hadn't addressed their traumatic experiences. And that's one of the first ways I got interested in the field. So a lot of, women with recurrent issues, physically, pelvic issues that weren't really a medical problem. So we could resolve that using these types of interventions. So that made me a fan and made me really appreciate the concreteness of the nonverbal mind.
And that's, I guess, where it really comes together with all different kinds of healthcare delivery, right? That
Yes.
it's not just psychiatry.
Right. So I think a lot of folks who have severe trauma and significant traumatic experiences do show up in the medical side seeking treatment, getting procedures, getting all kinds of things that really don't help them. I mean, they might help them temporarily, but they might not help make a difference because nobody's seeing kind of the forest for the trees. And in healthcare, in my work, like day to day, we do talk about this a lot because the folks who are struggling to make progress, if they're on the medical side, it's really confusing for medical professionals. They don't understand this. They get frustrated by it, and it doesn't lead to very good experiences on both sides.
Right. So what do you do?
Well, for me, they kind of stand out. Like, I think part of my experience, and this comes from the experience working, on the inpatient unit you referred to, where we would see reenactment on a regular basis. I see these folks who repeatedly access the same type of care procedures, and we can tease those out with data. You can look for that information in data and help to educate clinicians. I spend a lot of time consulting with other professionals in these settings to say, hey, have you thought about reenactment? That gives me an opportunity to explain it and then get them to scratch their head and think, I never would have thought of that. So that's a good thing to explore. That's the most important thing I can do for that.
Yeah, that's hugely important. And very unusual, I'm sure, that they're taken aback when they learn that they've been completely missing the point.
Yeah, I would say I think it's good to reflect on reenactment in particular, even with a client. If you talk about it in this way and explain it, even they can say like, oh, that makes sense. That could be it. And the clinicians do the same thing. So I think once you say it, they're like open to that possibility. And all I'm looking for is an opening to help them.
That light bulb moment where that thing that's been plaguing you for years finally has a name and makes some sense. So thank you, Lindra, so much for being with us. And we want to thank you for listening to Creating Presence. Coming up after the break, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Scott Giacomucci from the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Theory. We'll be right back after these messages.
If you would like your organization to be aligned in its values, practices, and skills to be trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and trauma-resilient, Creating Presence is the program you are looking for. The Creating Presence model is an online and coach certification program authored by internationally renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom. This program is designed to help your organization become certified as a safe and value-aligned place for both your staff and clients. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, the host of this broadcast. For more information as to how your organization can create presence, go to creatingpresence.net. Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. Sandy, Sarah, and their guests will discuss strategies and innovative practices for restoring our collective social health.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. Our guest for this segment is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. Scott is the director, founder, and owner of the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy. He provides clinical services at the center, as well as supervision, consultation, training, and organizational leadership. Scott's work has been internationally recognized. He's the recipient of various awards. He frequently presents training workshops at local, national, and international events, and has recently published Trauma-Informed Principles in Group Therapy, Psychodrama, and Organizations. So welcome, Scott. We're happy to have you.
Thank you, Sandy. It's an honor to be here with y'all.
Scott, I'm going to jump right in with a question. The dramatic arts have been used in cultures all around the world as part of healing through narrative and storytelling for centuries, really, maybe longer. What is psychodrama and how does it work in the context of trauma recovery?
Yeah. So psychodrama is actually one of the oldest therapies. It's been around over 100 years now. It was created by Jacob Moreno, who is a psychiatrist, a Romanian psychiatrist in Austria, who later immigrated to the United States. It's hard to explain in words like any of the other arts. You really have to see it and do it to really understand what it is. But the technical definition I like to use is that it's a action method that uses theater techniques and role playing to bring to life some of the issues and, more importantly, some of the solutions to the issues that we might be experiencing intrapsychically, interpersonally, or societally.
Very good definition. But you're right. It doesn't, it's really hard to capture that power of a group. I've been in a lot of psychodrama groups, and it was my totally favorite approach. What are some examples you've seen of using psychodrama with clients in their trauma recovery? So what, just brainstorm some examples.
Yeah, so many people are arguing that the experiential therapies, the creative arts therapies, are the treatment of choice for trauma now, based on all the new neuroscience research and, experience changes the brain. So in psychodrama, we can do anything, really. There's no limitation on where we can go. Some of the more common psychodrama enactments that I see related to trauma involve revisiting a moment of trauma or hurt or neglect and expressing what was unexpressed at the time and redoing the scene in a way that's more corrective and healing and provides closure. I do a lot of work with traumatic loss, where an individual will, through role playing, have an opportunity to talk to someone who died, who they didn't get a chance to say goodbye to, and have that closure, and then reverse roles and become their deceased loved one and see themselves through that person's eyes and say the things they needed to hear from that person in order to heal and make sense of the loss. We do a lot of inner child work with psychodrama, where somebody's talking to themselves as a child and providing protection and nurturing. And I do a lot of strength-based work where we're connecting with the strengths, intrapsychic, interpersonal, or transpersonal strengths that someone might need in order to renegotiate how the trauma lives within them. So in my work with psychodrama, I'm much less focused on reenacting actual trauma scenes as I am on creating experiences that provide closure, healing, and corrective experiences, or renegotiating how the trauma lives within someone.
How do you walk that fine line between doing some of that exposure work that feels really important, reenacting the experience, but not re-traumatizing people? Like how do you gauge that?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's like in psychodrama, we learn sociometry, which is awareness of the group dynamics. And we can't do psychodrama without warming the group up. And so as a facilitator, I have to be aware of every individual's window of tolerance in the room, not just the protagonist who's doing the scene or the role players, but also the observers. And I have to titrate the process in a way that meets the group where they're at. So some groups we can go deep and we can do some of the more intense, cathartic, confronting perpetrators type of work. And most of the time the group's not ready to do that. Or maybe the protagonist is, but the role players and the audience couldn't tolerate being in their body while that's happening. And so we modify things. We explore it intrapsychically instead of interpersonally, or we explore it from a position of strength. I always tell my trainees and students that when we have a psychodrama contract or goal, there's always at least 4 or 5 different psychodrama scenes that we could enact that would land us in the same place achieving that contract or goal. So there's a lot of flexibility in the process. It's not a manualized treatment.
And
Go
it
ahead.
includes what you were just pointing out. The other people are also playing roles in other people's dramas, right? That's a whole other part of it.
Yeah, how does that work? You read my mind, Sandy.
Yeah, psychodrama is fundamentally a group therapy, although we use it in individual sessions as well. Through the warming up process, we develop the group cohesion and tap into what we call tele in psychodrama, which is this socio-gravitational force that draws people together. It's the opposite of transference or countertransference, which is a distortion of a relationship. Tele is a two-way accurate knowing and being with another. And through those connections, the protagonist is asked to invite people to play roles in their psychodrama. And we encourage them to really trust their gut when they scan the room and think, oh, who could play the role of my mother? And oftentimes what will happen is they'll lock on to someone and not know why. And they'll trust their gut and pick that person. That person will play the role beautifully and authentically, and then later share that they're a parent themselves and have been struggling with the same thing with their kid. And so it's not exactly role playing, like people are really bringing themselves into the roles that they're playing. And the whole group is having a cathartic and integrative experience, not just the protagonist. We even can complicate it further and make clinical role assignments where if I'm doing a psychodrama, for example, last week I did a psychodrama, client had a near-death experience and felt like he was kind of living in this limbo between life and death. And we brought some strengths and support onto the stage and then had him have a conversation with death as an entity and with his higher power, with God as an entity. And if I knew there was someone in the room who was grappling with their relationship with death, I could suggest that they play the role of death. Or if someone was struggling with their own conception of a higher power, I could make a clinical role assignment and suggest they play that role so that they're not just playing it for the protagonist, but they're doing their own work through the role.
How do groups come together? How do you figure out if a group, is a good match? And what do you do when there are, people at very, very different places with what they need?
Yeah, this is like the most underrated and one of the most important aspects of doing group work is the pre-group screening assessment, having really clear inclusionary, exclusionary criteria for who's a good fit for the group. In my inpatient psychodrama work, there's really clear criteria on who's a good fit for this group. It's a trauma group and it's a psychodrama group. So just because someone has trauma doesn't mean that they're ready to do psychodrama with it in an inpatient unit. In outpatient, the criteria is similar but different. It also depends on what the focus of the group is going to be. If it's going to be more of a phase 1 trauma group using psychodrama, focused on establishing safety, psychoed, connection, strengths-based work, I can be more relaxed on criteria. But if it's going to be a group where we're going to process trauma and get into phase 2 trauma work, I need to be much more thoughtful and boundaried about who's appropriate, who's ready to do that. Otherwise, we risk re-traumatizing clients.
Yeah, that you brought up something really, really important, which is, the more powerful a technique is, the more potentially dangerous it is if it's not done properly.
Exactly. One of my trainees had the best metaphor for this, Sandy. He was at a 3-day training with me at the Phoenix Center, and he said, Scott, last week my dad taught me how to use a chainsaw, and this weekend I'm learning how to do psychodrama with you, and they feel oddly similar.
That's so perfectly accurate.
He said we can get a lot of work done quickly and efficiently if we have the right safety structures in place and know how to use the tool, but we could chop someone's arm off if we're not careful.
Yeah, exactly. Beautiful.
Scott, I have a practical question about your outpatient work specifically. As a clinician who works in outpatient, there are some really tight and very narrow guardrails around what services can be provided and what's reimbursed. And so I'm really curious about, we know these are best practices. We know that they're helpful. how do people access that resource through your work? How can we make this more available to the people who need it?
Yeah. No, I appreciate the question, Sarah. I think there's kind of two things that come to mind. One is like the limits of time and resources in agencies, where it's like you got 53 minutes and you can't do a 3-hour psychodrama session like we might traditionally do. So
Right.
there's ways to use psychodrama interventions within your traditional therapy session, like we might concretize roles or parts of self, or use objects to symbolically represent, what we're talking about, and talk to it rather than talk about it, or pull the empty chair out and do some short empty chair work. Or doubling is one of the foundational psychodrama interventions, where you offer one sentence as the client in an I statement. And if it fits, the client repeats it in their own words. And if it doesn't fit, they change it to make it fit for
Wow.
them. So there's ways we can modify it. And then I've really tried to make content accessible as much as possible, because the process to get trained as a psychodramatist is incredibly long. 780 training hours
Wow.
for practitioner level, more hours than my doctorate program. And that's just the first requirement. Then there's practicum, supervision, written exam, and an actual experiential exam. So my first book is published open access, so anybody can download the entire textbook. It's called Social Work, Sociometry, and Psychodrama. And then I've created a bunch of YouTube videos where people can learn little bits about psychodrama and trauma-informed care, and more in a more accessible way, integrated into their work.
That's great. Because it's kind of the rebirth of psychodrama is what you've been shepherding into the world, because it went away for, a couple decades from the time I was doing it until, then we went through this period where everything was about giving people drugs and they didn't really need therapy supposedly. And now we're back to, no, that's not working. We really we have to remember and, have it really well structured. What have you been using it in organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's psychodrama is not just the psychotherapy. It actually came from a mystical philosophy and a religion from the founder, then was part of his vision of societry, or psychiatry for society, then became a theater of spontaneity, then became community work, and it was the last thing Moreno created was psychodrama as a psychotherapy.
Wow.
So psychodrama is used constantly in other settings. Um, I often will use it in organizations where I'll come in, maybe like in corporate settings, for example. I might assess the strengths, threats, weaknesses, opportunities of an organization, and then create structured role plays for the board members or the leaders to practice engaging in difficult conversations that are emerging in the workplace. Or one of my favorite things is in supervision in organizations. I'll come into like a residential program, say, what are the most difficult interactions you keep having with clients or residents? And say a recovery house is struggling with getting their folks out of bed, and yeah, there people are just butting heads with the staff. We'll reenact one of those scenes, pause it, do doubling from each of the roles, and try to access and get a sense of what's going on emotionally beneath the surface for the resident in this moment and for the staff member in this moment. Gain a better understanding of the dynamics underneath the surface, perhaps the traumatic reenactment that's happening, or the traumatic transference and countertransference on both ends. We can even bring those other roles in. Who's the client projecting onto you as a staff member right now? Pull out an empty chair for that person. Who are you projecting onto the client in countertransference? And let's differentiate those roles and do your own work on that. And then I could have the other the rest of the group come in and do what we call role training, where everyone gets a chance to step into the staff member's shoes and practice a different and new way of responding in the same moment. So we could see 15 people take a minute each and respond to that tough client situation in a different way.
Wow. I want to jump back to your mentioning doing this with boards of directors at the corporate level, because boy, do I want to be a fly on the wall for that. And we have about a minute left, but I appreciate how you start with a SWOT analysis, which is something they're comfortable with. And
Yeah.
then I imagine you're bringing them to a place where they are not comfortable at all. Like, how do you get people to engage when this is so outside their comfort zone?
Yeah, all about the warming up process. So in psychodrama, we say that no such thing as resistance, just that people are not warmed up enough or they're warmed up to something else.
Mm.
So we try to meet them where they're at in their warm up. So if it's a board meeting, they're familiar with the SWOT analysis, their core values. I'll do sociometry related to something they're comfortable, familiar with. And then once they're warmed up, as a warming up process is engaged, anxiety decreases and spontaneity increases. This was Moreno's theory 100 years ago, and more recently that's been proven through quantitative research. So through a warming up process, the group accesses spontaneity and is able to engage in a way they never would have been able to if we just tried to jump right into role plays from the start.
This has been fascinating, and I feel like I've learned so much from you in this short time. Thank you so much for joining us. And we want to thank you for listening to Creating Presence. We just heard from Dr. Scott Giacomucci. Coming up after our break, we'll talk with our next guest, David McCorkle. We'll be back shortly.
If you wish to go into production to provide your own trauma training, Lakeside Productions can provide you studio rental, design, filming, editing, learning management support, and consultation for video streaming for your organization or systems of care. Lakeside Productions has developed over 50 courses and videos that are all trauma-based and customized with a variety of applications. If you would like to have more information regarding Lakeside Productions, go to our website at lakesidetraining.org. Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. Sandy, Sarah, and their guests will discuss strategies and innovative practices for restoring our collective social health.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandy Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy, and we're going to continue our conversation now with our guest, David McCorkle. David, whose life first as a Broadway actor, began his career in that way in the original cast of Hello, Dolly. David was working in a domestic violence shelter when I met him, when the work with the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services took on the research project for the sanctuary model. And David was instrumental in gathering the data. He then served for many years as an organizational consultant for the Sanctuary Institute. And now, in addition to his individual therapy practice, he does community-based work at the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities in North Carolina, even though he lives in New York City. And he's embodying the concept of actions speak louder than words. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you too.
David, Sandy mentioned this mantra of yours about actions speaking louder than words. And we're talking about embodiment and enactment. Tell us about what that mantra means in that context.
So obviously it means that words are limiting and that many people don't have words. So to give you a concrete example is that I often use objects in community work to start a community, a gathering in a community. I will often put musical instruments on the tables, noisemakers, things to draw on, and maybe some sort of objects that could be puzzling to people, like, why is that there? In my office, I have lots of big kind of medieval looking keys. And just to evoke people's, when you walk in the door, to begin to wonder. I think we lose the capacity to wonder when we've been traumatized and when we've been oppressed and when we've been distressed.
Yeah, I can see that. What's the work like? What are you doing with these communities? Who are they, and what are you doing there?
So, right, sometimes I ask myself, last week I was way up in the mountains of North Carolina, and I did say, what am I doing here? And then I walk into some agencies that, provide people with groceries, clothing, toys, and just a warm space. And what we've done is to help those organizations be essentially socially and emotionally aware. So I would sit down with a core group of people in this organization, and I want to give them an experience of gathering rather than just, talking heads. So I might I might do some risk taking. As Scott said, there's always got to be a warm up, and I try to do some kind of warm up. It could even be quietness together. I could, since it's the mountains, I could bring, a musical instrument and just play something. But I will often bring props. And also the props create a kind of mystery, like, what the hell is that giraffe doing on the middle of the table? So and that's a really good one where that opens conversations that is not particularly verbal, not just asking a direct question, going back to the whole principle of our work, which is to involve people. There's an old quote by Benjamin Franklin. I think there are many versions of this quote: tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, and involve me and I understand. So when you use objects, people start to be involved, if nothing else, to be curious. Maybe they think I'm a little crazy, but they're curious. And then we use the objects to have a conversation.
David, I feel like this would be a really interesting intervention to use in family therapy. And I'm thinking about, some particular opportunities that this might apply to. And I got a good understanding of that idea of warming up and changing the perspective or the conversation. In your work with these communities, where is it that you want to go with them? Like, what is the place that you're hoping will emerge through these conversations?
Yes, I think that I want, people, I'm always concerned about burnout and vicarious trauma, because even if you're only giving out food and you see a little child walk in with his family who's malnourished, it's going to have an impact on you. So I would say part of the work about, actions speak louder than words is how can you nurture nurturers? How can you care for caregivers? So we want to replenish them, and people often forget, this work is contagious. So they get discouraged, they lose hope. And so how can you rekindle hope? How can you rekindle compassion for people who are so discouraged in life? And literally, as Sandy mentioned, in a domestic violence, who are broken, sometimes literally. So when they walk into a place, without being obnoxious, and too friendly, that can go the wrong way too. What can you do with your look? And this, of course, I mean, I always talk about the look of love, sort of a polyvagal theory part, and engaging the nervous system with your eyes and the sound of your voice. So we might actually practice using our voices. We might all practice saying, welcome. I'm glad you're here. This afternoon, I think being with is a big theme of work in agencies that might not be about therapy. This afternoon, I'm going to, I volunteer at a warming center for migrants, primarily from Senegal. And I experimented, we kind of did it at the last minute because the migration issue here is so pressing. But I said that I'm not going to be a part of the food giving or the giving out socks or whatever we have to offer. I'm going to just be with people. So I had that intention. And you know, the response, the mirror neuron exchange, the relaxation in someone's body when you really look into their eyes and your voice is soft and welcoming.
You're reminding me of something we've talked about before, almost a borrowing hope. And this concept that you're describing of just being with people and being centered is a way, like, if you are embodying that, they can borrow that from you. It also sounds to me like the work that you're doing, sort of a culmination or maybe a crashing together, I don't know, you'll tell me, of your theater background, your work as an educator, and your work as a social worker. What's that been like, and how do you see these roles all overlapping?
Well, I think that I may have ADHD, but I've never been diagnosed. But I think that engaging is such an important part. And in my academic career, I was often not engaged. And I had to find ways to motivate myself to get involved, to learn. So when I began to be a teacher, I wanted to do something that would engage people, a version of warm up, a version of making them curious, and, you know, getting out of their heads and into the whole experience, not trying to encapsulate what we do into just a thought, but more an action. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And clearly we also, I think what I bring as a, you know, an actor, a musical comedy actor, is I bring dancing, I bring singing, and I bring acting, and, you know, costumes if necessary, change of light if necessary, musical instruments. So a lot of times I think gestures are really important for people, and to ask them to make a gesture. If you're doing a feelings check-in, don't use words, use a gesture. Back to props, I use puppets a lot. I've used puppets when I do EMDR or other therapies that I will ask.
Can you just tell our listeners what EMDR is?
Oh, yes. Well, it has a long title, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And it might just be called eye movement therapy, except that we use tappers and other, you know, things like this. And so it's basically an evidence-based modality that helps people reprocess their trauma and find a new future. And it involves some bilateral stimulation. And it's, excuse me, it's very much a protocol. So, you know, me, with being a creative person, sitting there, and they're literally like steps that you do. You know, the first rule is to do no harm. But then I'm always, you know, I was thinking, well, maybe this is not going to be creative anymore. And I was I started doing it after 9/11, and I just followed the book kind of. And I wasn't really sure that I believed that it would work. And it always did. And it's just causing me to think of an experience using creativity once again. I saw a woman in a domestic violence shelter who had been abused as a child and then left the country that she was in and came to this country. And she had to speak to gain custody of her child. And it was one of the first times we did EMDR, and there's a thing in EMDR about developing a resource. So I asked her if there was a song that made her feel really strong and that her voice could be heard. And a singer, and I asked her, is there a singer who sings that song? And she said, yes. Just immediately, this is a person very depressed, very scared. And then immediately just the question brought her to life. And she said, yes, there's a song. It's I Did It My Way. And the singer is Charo. I don't know if folks know Charo.
Yeah.
Charo is about as out there as you could get.
This is
He's like in everybody's face.
Yeah, boomers and Gen Xers will know, but nobody after that.
Nobody after that. But so she actually took a picture of Charo and put it in her purse and went into the court and thought of Charo and the song I Did It My Way, and her voice came out. So that's just the perfect example of using theater. It's a song, and even if you don't sing it out loud, even if you think it has power.
You work with both children and adults, and do you see any significant differences in how you use the expressive therapies with young people and with adults?
I mean, yes, I think they're all different. I mean, little children are the easiest, and teenagers are the hardest. And adults, you just have to assess, what lack of embodiment they have. Are they living in their bodies? Are they enacting things by being shut down? I see a lot of shut down. I see a lot of intellectualization. So I've become curious about how we could actualize that in the therapy, whether using, like some of the things that Scott talked about, whether it's like the empty chair. Just yesterday, I worked with a couple and I had them do a role reversal. And I used it more as a theater thing. I coached them a little bit. I had worked with them before, and I said, would you mind if I'm the director? And we'll start the scene and you'll change roles. And they needed a little bit of coaching to stay in role because the guy was playing his wife and the wife was playing the husband. And, it was not easy. Wait a minute, am I the wife talking about the husband, or am I the wife just being my wife? So, and then suddenly with just a little bit of coaching, the role play happened. And I didn't have to interpret it. I didn't have to sum it up. It simply happened. And you could see the change in their bodies, in the way they looked at each other, and the way they left when they ended the session. So I think the best training I have is I go to the theater. I've been recently going to the theater more, and that's something Sandy and I have shared through the years. And I'll see a show like The Days of Wine and Roses, which it's not a feel good show, it's a feel everything show. So just that kind of thing, keeps my own creativity alive.
Thank you so much, David.
Yeah, thanks,
We've
David.
really loved hearing your stories and learning about your experience and celebrating the exciting and good work that you're doing.
Well, thank you.
We've just heard from Dr. Lindra Bills, Scott Giacomochi, and David McCorkle. Join us next week to continue our exploration when we'll discuss how nature and nurture apply to child development. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. Thanks for listening. See you next week.